Hello, you are most welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Real Impartation Moment on Tuesday Night Anatomy with Daniel Okwan. Today's section, I quickly run with you the developmental anatomy of the urinary system. My friends, one thing that we know is that this development bit, yes, is actually called the genital urinary system. But I will try and segregate the urinary system from that of the genital system, so that I will treat that of the genital system, later. My friends, one important thing that we know about the development of the urinary system is that it is pretty simple. There is, no challenge regarding its development, because its development is coming from only two sources. So we just need to understand only two sources, okay, for us to be able to, deal with this. And what are these two sources? One of them is what we call the urogenital sinus. One thing we know about this urogenital sinus is that it's part of what we call the cloaca, okay? And this cloaca, yes, is an extension of the hindgut, okay, that we find. And we know that the hindgut is coming from the secondary yolk sac, and therefore it's endodermal. So it tells me that, yes, this urogenital sinus, which will give rise to some part of the urinary system, yet in humans, yes, will be, of course, endodermal. Not only that, I also need what we call the intermediate mesoderm, and I will go through that one with you. But more importantly, I will need what we call the nephrogenic cord of the intermediate mesoderm. So my friends, at the end of this section, we should be able to tell the whole story regarding, the developmental anatomy of the urinary system. And so, without much ado, let's set the ball rolling. So my friends, before I go on and tell you the development of the urinary system, what I want you to know is to look at some bits of what we call the trilaminar embryonic disc. Yes, everyone knows that in the third week of intrauterine life, the bilaminar primitive embryonic disc, yes, get transformed to become the trilaminar embryonic disc. Yes, all the contribution coming from the epiblast. Yes, if you've not watched that video, please get that video link and watch it. Now, this is a section through the embryo, and what I see over here is that, yes, we know that in the third week we will have what we call ectoderm. And my friends, ectoderm over here, sorry, we will have ectoderm. Okay, now this ectoderm that we find over here, what will happen is that it's under the influence of this guy over here, which we find it in the mesoderm over here, is called notochord. It will cause the surface overlying, ectoderm to be transformed to become what we call neuroectoderm. Eventually form the neural folds, which will of course get transformed to form what we call the neural tube. The source of the central nervous system by way of course the brain and of course the spinal cord. I'm not interested in that one. Then of course we know that the intermediate zone over here is the mesoderm, where of which dwells of course the notochord. But of course we know that the origin of the notochord is not in the mesoderm, it's coming from the epiblast. That's one thing we know. So this notochord which dwells, okay, in the mesoderm, okay, is the one which influences the overlying, ectoderm to be transformed to become, neuroectoderm, eventually becoming of our neural folds, which will join to become the neural tube. Okay, so that's what we've seen. And then beyond the mesoderm, yes, below that we have what we call endoderm, and the endoderm is in relation with the yolk sac. Now, my friends, one thing that we find is that in the mesoderm, yes, not only are there some kind of transformation taking place in the ectoderm by way of converting it to become neuroectoderm, but also in the mesoderm, there are substantial changes taking place over here. And my friends, one of them, yes, with the axis of the notochord, okay, serving as a landmark, so that this becomes the midline over here. Then there are those changes which will take place on either side, okay, of this notochord. And the first one we find is that we will have that mesoderm over here called what we call paraaxial mesoderm. So the mesoderm, okay, is differentiated into three parts, and the one which is medial, okay, the one which is just next to the notochord, okay, is what we call the paraaxial mesoderm. Then of course we move away from that, we go to what we call the intermediate mesoderm. Okay, the one shown over here, intermediate mesoderm, and then even lateral to that one we have what we call the lateral plate mesoderm. So these are the three differentiations that we find on either side of the notochord, okay, of the trilaminar embryonic disc in the mesoderm. Okay, and of course we know that this lateral plate mesoderm will also go through some kind of differentiation. And what are these differentiations? Yes, with the help of a coelom formed in the lateral plate mesoderm, where it's called intra embryonic coelom, we're able to get two layers of this lateral plate mesoderm. The one which is close to ectoderm is what we call, yes, anything ectoderm has to do with the body wall, and that's why we call it somatopleuric lateral plate mesoderm. Then the one which is in relation with the endoderm and therefore the yolk sac, okay, yes, the yolk sac will give rise to important viscera, okay, in the, for instance, the gut, and therefore, the word viscera has to do with splanchnic, and that is why we call this portion of the mesoderm splanchnopleuric lateral plate mesoderm. Okay, so that's what we find over here. My friends, the reason why I showed you this image, this diagram over here, is that I'm interested in this guy over here, which is the intermediate mesoderm. The reason is simple, because this intermediate mesoderm, I will show you that it will also differentiate, okay, becoming what we call nephrogenic cord, and then at a point, yes, that kind of genital ridge will develop. I'm not also interested in the genital ridge, because the genital ridge is the one which will give rise to, of course, the gonads. And what do I mean by gonads? The primary organs, okay, sex organs that we find in males and of course females. In males we talk about the testes, in females we talk about the ovary. Okay, so that is one thing that we find. Okay, so having seen this, then let's move on and see what we have. Now, one other thing that I want you to know, so we've seen one of the sources of this urinary system. I told you about the intermediate mesoderm. We've seen that one, which of course also differentiate, giving us what we call the nephrogenic cord, which of course at a point will have what we call the genital ridge. The other one is what we call the urogenital sinus. But the urogenital sinus is not a complete, structure on its own. It's actually a derivative of the cloaca. But my friends, this cloaca, okay, this is the dilatation that we find at the hindgut, okay, of what we call the GIT, okay, so development, the hindgut. And once I told you that the hindgut is what we call endodermal, yes, unlike in the case of what we call the intermediate mesoderm, it's mesodermal. So it means that as far as the development of the urinary system is concerned, the main derivative sources will be coming from mesoderm and of course endoderm. Okay, so this guy over here, which of course is the cloaca, initially is a connection, okay, between what we call the urogenital sinus and the rectum, the primitive rectum. Okay, so that what we see is that there will be that kind of septum beginning to form between, of course, the one which will give rise to the rectum and the anal canal, okay, and then of course the one which will give rise to some portion of the urinary system. Mainly we talk about the urinary bladder and of course some portion of the urethra, okay, for instance in males. Okay, so that is what we see. So this septum which will be separating them, okay, will be called the urorectal septum. The reason is simple, because in front over here, yes, will be forming some portion of the urinary system, and the one over here will be forming the rectum. Okay, so the septum over here is the urorectal septum. Eventually, yes, separating at the end of the day, so that we know that yes, we defecate, and then the opening over there is towards the hind aspect, and that is why there will be that kind of membrane which will be formed, and that membrane is what we call the cloacal membrane. The cloacal membrane, which of course will have to rupture, okay, where it's made up of only ectoderm and endoderm, no mesoderm. Why? Because a thin membrane which will have to rupture, okay, giving rise to the opening of the anal canal. Now, in situations where this kind of septum fails to form, whether it is congenital, yes, sometimes it could be acquired in life, yes, it could also be iatrogenic. For instance, yes, then what will happen is that there's going to be something we call fistula, okay. That fistula may happen so that in case you may see someone who will be urinating and defecating at the same time, means that the septum, yes, has become compromised. Okay, so that is one thing that I want you to know over here. So it means that the ventral portion, I'm interested in the ventral portion of the cloaca, which is the urogenital sinus. Okay, then the hind one will give rise to the rectum. So that's what we have to know. Now, one thing that as I'm talking about, yes, I told you that the intermediate mesoderm, my friends, I have the intermediate mesoderm. The intermediate mesoderm over here, yes, I told you that it will differentiate to become what we call the nephrogenic cord. My friends, this guy over here, I'm trying to show you, this is the nephrogenic cord, and at a point, okay, at a point, eventually I find this, okay, which is of course the genital ridge. The genital ridge which will give rise eventually becoming of course the gonad by way of the testes in males, and of course the ovary in female. Okay, so this is how the whole thing is. So I am interested in this guy which is called the nephrogenic cord, the one where my cursor is running, the nephrogenic cord. The reason is simple: this nephrogenic cord will also differentiate, giving rise to three things which will occur in succession. And what do I mean by that? Let me show you that. Yes, the nephrogenic cord, yes, will give rise to, of course, three successive, structures. And what is the first thing which will develop? The first thing which will develop is that, now, the point is that the kidneys, it goes through these kind of, successive developmental stages. Some of them fail to persist, okay? So one thing is that the first one to develop, which develops in the beginning of the 4th week of intrauterine life, the embryonic period, I see this guy over here, which is called the pronephros. So I'm trying to talk about the nephrogenic cord differentiating. Yes, it's bilateral on either side. Okay, the nephrogenic cord, yes, on either side differentiating, giving rise to this. The first structure that we find over here, sitting on top here, is called pronephros. You know what? Something nephros has to do with the kidney, and pro has to do with before. So before the real kidney, came to being, yes, there was this structure. My friends, this kidney fails to survive. It fails to function in humans, but of course in fishes is able to thrive well over there. So in fishes, the kidney, yes, is coming from the pronephros only. Okay, so that is what we find over here. And I told you that it begins forming in the beginning of the 4th week of intrauterine life. I'll show you other things about this guy. Then, because it fails to develop, yes, but one thing that we find is that there will be a duct and about 5 to 7 tubules also forming. I'll show you that one. And then I go to the next one, which is known as what we call mesonephros. Guys, one thing that we find over here is that this mesonephros is quite elongated compared to all other structures that may form the kidney. Okay, this is what we call the mesonephros. Again, the mesonephros will also have some tubules, about 7 to 80 of them, and then again it will also have a duct, which we call the mesonephric duct. I'll show you that one. Okay, but my friends, that one will start developing, or it will appear at the end of the 4th week of intrauterine life, but it will begin to function after about 4 weeks. So it begins to function around the 9th week of intrauterine life. Okay, this guy over here, which is of course the mesonephros. Now, one thing that we find is that unlike in the case of pronephros, of course, pronephros will have tubules. It will also have a pronephric duct. The pronephric duct will give way, or it will serve as the roadmap, so that the next duct, which we call the mesonephric duct, okay, in the mesonephros will develop. But my friends, unlike in the case of the pronephric duct, which will degenerate, will not persist, that of mesonephric duct, yes, will persist. Okay, persist. And one thing I want to tell you is that this mesonephros may even function for a short time in the early embryonic period. Then of course, yes, this mesonephros will also fail to exist. Now rather, we find it in amphibians. It's able to thrive there in amphibians. Okay, so that is one thing that we find. And then the ultimate structure which will develop from what we call the nephrogenic cord becoming the real kidney is the metanephros. Now my friends, the word meta has to do with next to. So the one next to becoming the real kidney is the metanephros. The one which will really give rise to the kidney, okay, is what we call the metanephros. Okay, so that is one thing that we find over here. Now then, so this is coming from the intermediate mesoderm, the nephrogenic cord. And of course, one thing is that these duct by way of the mesonephric duct will also be coming from, of course, the mesonephros, and for that matter from intermediate mesoderm, from mesoderm. And one thing that we find is that rather, if you take a closer look at it, now we say that this nephrogenic cord, they are bilateral and they are oriented posteriorly. Now I'm looking from front to back. Okay, now this cloaca, and more importantly, I'm looking at the urogenital sinus, is anterior, okay, to what we call the nephrogenic cord. Okay, And so that is, I mean, one thing that we find. Now it means that what I see is that this mesonephric duct, which is persistent, okay, it doesn't degenerate, okay, will be invading the posterior wall of the urogenital sinus of the cloaca. Okay, so that is, I mean, one thing that we have to know. My friends, this, I mean, mesonephric duct, okay, my friend, this nephrogenic duct is also having an eponym, and that eponym is known as Wolffian's duct. Yes, sometimes we also call it Leydig's duct. Okay, so that these kind of things that we find. Otherwise, we want to simply call it the nephric duct. Okay, now you see the other derivatives even coming from this, I mean, mesonephros. We also talk about, you know, the para, you know, mesonephric duct. Yes, when we look at the development of the, I mean, male and female reproductive systems, so we look at that. So what have we seen? Now if you look at this is the embryo, cross section of the embryo, and I told you that we have three systems. We have what we call the pronephric system, yes, which will of course thrive in fishes, okay, and that one will disappear because yes, it doesn't have the capacity in human. And my friends, one thing is that if you look at the embryo, there's a cranial region, there's a cephalic region. As I come this way, I'm coming to the cervical region, going downwards and all the way. So it means that the pronephros will develop in around the cervical region, okay, of what we call the intermediate mesoderm. So that is one thing that we find. Okay, but of course I told you that about, you know, 5 to 7 of the tubules will form, and then of course the duct that will be formed, okay, will be called, you know, the pronephric duct. This duct that you find over here, okay, the red color structure that we find over here. But my friends, this duct will only serve, okay, as giving, you know, the pathway for the next one to develop. I told you that in the beginning of the 4th week of intrauterine life, that is when this, I mean, pronephric system will develop. Then of course we go to, of course, the, I mean, the mesonephros, which yes, although may function temporarily, yes, in early intrauterine life, okay, then what will happen is that what we find is that the duct will persist. And what is the name of that duct? It is the mesonephric duct. Not only that, it will also have some tubules. And what are these tubules? About, you know, I mean, 70 to 80 of them, okay, spirally coursing structures, yes, will be found over there, drain into it. Okay, and that one will appear around the thoraco-abdominal region, okay, the very elongated structure. Then I told you that the one which will really form the kidney, okay, in humans, and not only in humans, even in some reptiles and of course birds, okay, we have what we call the metanephros. And my friends, the metanephros, yes, will appear around the 5th week of intrauterine life, where in the pelvic region, okay, that is where it appears, in the pelvic region. So initially to appear in the pelvic region, but of course we know that the final kidneys will dwell in the posterior abdominal wall, okay, retroperitoneal structures, you know, primary retroperitoneal structures, okay, so that after about, you know, 4 weeks after its emergence, it will begin to function. Okay, so that is, I mean, what we find over here. Okay, so that is that for the development of the kidneys. So what are we talking about now? I told you something that yes, we will have the cloaca, and the cloaca, yes, the ventral portion, with the help of the urorectal septum, we are able, okay, to get what we call the urogenital sinus, okay, and I'll show you really what this urogenital sinus is doing. Now I told you that yes, there will be that kind of, I mean, mesonephric tubules, okay, about 70 to 80 of them, and the main duct, which is the mesonephric duct, okay, it doesn't degenerate, okay. So but what do I see? I see that the one which gave rise to the pronephros, yes, they begin to degenerate, okay. So that is, I mean, one thing that we find. Now one important thing which I want you to know is that I told you that the one which is really giving rise to the kidney, okay, is what we call the metanephros. Now the metanephros, okay, assuming yes, you have the caudal portion of what we call the nephrogenic cord giving rise to the metanephros. Now one thing is that when this what we call mesonephric duct, okay, invades the posterior wall of the urogenital sinus, okay, not only that, even getting the terminal portion over here around the 5th week of intrauterine life only, then what will happen is that there will be a branch, okay, of this mesonephric duct invading the metanephros. and once it invades it, okay, that tract which invaded it, we call it ureteric bud. And once it invades it, there's some kind of local perforation around where the duct invaded, and that is what we call metanephrogenic, or simply metanephric blastema. My friends, metanephric blastema. So as far as the development of the kidney is concerned, in the metanephros, metanephric blastema is very important. I'll show you the derivatives of this one, which is also mesodermal, and then of course the ureteric bud, which is also mesodermal because it's coming from the mesonephric duct. Okay, we'll be going through it. So what are the derivatives? What are we talking about? So there we are. Now if you look at it, if you look at the mesonephric blastema, which is that kind of localized perforation around the ureteric bud, okay, in the metanephros, it will be giving rise to the secretory portion of what we call the kidney. And what do I mean by secretory portion? If you look at this metanephric, blastemal cap that we find over here, it becomes a nephric, vesicle, eventually elongating, differentiating, and then eventually giving rise to what? It will be giving rise to, of course, this guy over here, which is called the Bowman's capsule. Yes, both the visceral and parietal layers of the Bowman's capsule will arise from what we call the metanephric blastema. Okay, so that is, what we find over here. But not only that, yes, we also have what we call the proximal convoluted tubule. Not only that, we also have the distal convoluted tubule and everything about the loop of Henle. And my friends, you know the loop of Henle more than I do. You know that we have what we call the thick descending limb of the loop of Henle. Okay, we have the thin descending limb, we have the thin segment of the loop of Henle, we have the thin ascending limb, we have the thick ascending limb of the, yes, everything about it, yes, will be derived from what the metanephric blastema. And one important thing which you have to connect, okay, there's a connection between the collecting duct or the collecting tubule, okay, to it. And what is that one? It's called the connecting, okay, tubule. Not collecting, it's called connecting tubule. And so the connecting tubule also forms part of what we call the derivatives of the metanephric blastema. Okay, so that is one thing that we find. My friends, I told you that apart from metanephric blastema, we also have the ureteric bud. Yes, the ureteric bud will give rise to the what we call the collecting system of the kidney. And what we mean by the collecting system of the kidney, what we mean is that, yes, we see this one which is shown in blue over here. This guy over here, yes, you can see it is becoming elongated, it is differentiating, eventually becoming what we call the collecting system of the kidney. And so the collecting system of the kidney, we talk about the collecting tubule, and for that matter, the collecting duct. Okay, so please get to know collecting tubule, collecting duct. And not only that one, we talk about the renal papilla. Yes, it's not really shown over here. Renal papilla of the, renal, medulla region. Renal papilla is found over there. It's also forming part of the derivatives of the collecting system of the kidney, and that is coming from the ureteric bud. And not only that, we talk about the major and minor calyces. You know that one, major and minor calyces eventually becoming what we call the renal pelvis. And it doesn't end there. Even we talk about, the name is called ureteric bud, so it makes sense that the distal continuation of the renal pelvis, which is the ureter, will also be derived from what we call the ureteric bud. So these are the derivatives coming from, of course, the ureteric bud. So please get to understand these things. But remember, the key thing is that all these structures, they are mesodermal. Why? Because they are eventually coming from what we call the nephrogenic cord, which is coming from what we call the intermediate mesoderm. Now, so having seen the kidney, then it makes sense that, yes, from the ureter, eventually the urine will have to be drained into the urinary bladder. That is why the next structure that we want to look at is the development of the urinary bladder. My friends, the urinary bladder is pretty simple. I've told you already, from the cloaca, the ventral portion of the cloaca, which is the urogenital sinus. Yes, it's essentially that one. That's what we are talking about. So it means that it is the urogenital sinus, okay, which will give rise to the urinary bladder. Actually, the vesical part of the urogenital sinus. Now remember that anything vesical has to do with the urinary bladder, because I told you that some portion will give rise to the urethra. Then we have to be specific. We have to talk about the vesical part of the urogenital sinus. Okay, so that is what we see. So now if you take a closer look at this structure over here, now you find that there's the urogenital sinus, and you can see that this guy, which is of course the mesonephros, is duct, okay, by way of the mesonephric duct, yes, will be invading the posterior wall. My friends, get to know that it will be invading the posterior wall of the urogenital sinus. It's a key important thing that you have to understand, and that one explains why, of course, we have the smooth posterior part, because these ducts, okay, by way of the invasion of these mesonephric ducts, yes, will be absorbed, okay, in what we call the posterior wall of the urogenital sinus, giving rise to a smooth triangular shaped posterior part of the urinary bladder, which is devoid of rugae. Okay, you know, the urinary bladder will be thrown into folds, the mucosal folds known as rugae, but of course the posterior part, smooth triangular shaped structure over there leading to the neck of the urinary bladder, that one is smooth. Okay, that is called a trigone. So please get to understand that, and that explains why, although I'm saying that the urinary bladder, the vesical portion of the urogenital sinus, which is endodermal, okay, one thing is that the posterior triangular smooth pathway is called a trigone, will not be endodermal. Okay, why? It will be mesodermal. The reason is simple, because it is from the absorption of what you call the invasion by, of course, the mesonephric duct. So please get to understand it. Of course, we know that the urinary bladder, yes, will be having that kind of tracheal system by way of the mucosa. We talk about muscularis and of course adventitia. Now the remaining portion, yes, will be coming from the splanchnopleuric, okay, lateral plates mesoderm. Okay, so that is one thing that you have to know. And of course, we know the epithelial will be endodermal. Okay, as we've explained, from the urogenital sinus. So this diagram is trying to show you the invasion through the posterior wall. I told you there's the cloaca, the ventral portion of the cloaca, urogenital sinus, and then of course the mesonephric duct to be invading the posterior wall. Okay, so right now we are looking at it from a posterior aspect. So the mesonephric duct has invaded. Okay, so eventually they will be absorbed. Okay, they will converge, and of course you get absorbed over there, forming of course the trigone. So it means that you can see that the color code, the trigone, is having a different color. Why? Because it is, going to be coming from, the mesonephric duct, which is of course mesodermal. So having seen that, then of course from the urinary bladder we go to the urethra. Now more importantly, I'm interested in the male urethra. Yes, I'll show you the various distinctions. Of course, the male urethra, we have what you call the prostatic, we have what you call the membranous, we have what you call the penile or the spongy, and we have the most terminal portion which develops in the glans penis. Okay, so that is that one. Now, one thing that you have to know is that the distal continuation of the urogenital sinus, not the vesical part, the distal continuation, okay, around week 7, okay, continuing downwards, yes, to week 8, will give rise to what we call the urethra. Okay, so that is essentially one thing we have to know. So it means that by and large, every part of the urethra, let me say invariably every part of the urethra, with the exception of some few cases, I'll talk about them, okay, will be coming from what we call, will be endodermal. Okay, so that is one important thing, except some portion which is of course the posterior portion of the most terminal portion of the prostatic urethra, because it will be from, yes, the same absorption of what we call the nephrogenic duct, okay, will be giving rise to that posterior part, okay, up to the level of what you call the ejaculatory duct. Okay, will also be some portion of it, maybe what you call maybe mesodermal. Okay, so that is one thing that you have to know. With the exception of that, every portion of the urinary bladder invariably will be, endodermal. Of course, there will be a catch. The catch over there is that the distalmost portion of the male urethra, okay, in the glans penis, yes, because developing the glans penis, what will happen is that it will be ectodermal. So initially it starts as an ectodermal solid cord, okay, in the glans penis, the urethra over there, okay, will be ectodermal. Initially it's a solid cord, but later, yes, there will be a canal, generated in it. So that is, one thing that we find. Now, in case of females, the story is simple. The story is simple, saying that one thing that we know is that the female urethra, okay, is very short, just about 3 to 4 centimeters long, unlike a male who is about 18 to 20 centimeters long. And for females, one important thing that we find is that no ectodermal portion. Why? Because it doesn't develop in what we call the clitoris. Okay, it doesn't develop in the clitoris, but rather it projects through what we call the vestibule. Okay, so that is what we see. And one thing that I want you to know is that because of that, it will be derived mainly, okay, from what we call the urogenital sinus. okay, the distal continuation of the urogenital sinus, and so it means that it will be endodermal. But there's also an exception, the posterior wall, okay, of it, due to the absorption, okay, by what we call the nephrogenic duct, okay, the one which form the trigone will, extend downwards, and that is why some portion, the posterior wall, yes, will be, of course, mesodermal. Other than that, all other areas of the urinary bladder, of the urethra in females, yes, will be, of course, endodermal. But my friends, one thing that we find, yes, when we look at the development of the male and female, that we see it better. We see that what we call, there will be two urethral folds, okay, in male, which will fuse to close the, of course, the underside of the urethra of the male organ, okay, and therefore forming the male penile urethra over there, okay. So it means that, yes, the ventral portion of what we call the male urethra, yes, will be, of the male organ by way of the penis, okay, will be coming from what we call the urethral folds, otherwise what we call the genital folds, okay. And these same urethral folds, yes, will be giving rise to what we call the labia minora. Well, look at that, I'll explain that one to you. So my friends, there we are. If you look at the posterior wall of the urinary bladder, you can see there's that kind of smooth, in both cases, that smooth triangular shaped posterior wall. That is what we call a trigone. And I'm trying to tell you that a trigone is formed from the absorption of what we call the of the mesonephric duct, okay. And that one even extends a bit downwards, okay, it extends a bit down. That's why in female the posterior wall, yes, will be mesodermal. In case of the male, just the proximal portion, most proximal portion of the prostatic urethra will be, mesodermal. So what am I talking about in males? What do I see? I see three areas. There's the prostate gland surrounding it, and this portion of the urethra therefore becomes the prostatic urethra. Then the one where is running through the genital diaphragm, okay, will be called the membranous urethra. Then as it goes downwards, we have what we call the penile or the spongy urethra. And then what I'm trying to talk about is that the most terminal portion, which develops in the glans penis, okay, which is having this navicular fossa, okay, is the one which of course will be ectodermal, okay, because it's developing in the glans penis. All these areas, yes, will be of course endodermal, okay, with the exception of the most proximal portion of the posterior wall of the prostatic urethra, and of course the posterior wall of the female urethra being, of course, mesodermal in origin. And you can see the length, I said in females very short. That is why females are very prone to UTIs, unlike in the case of males, okay. Yes, that's kind of things, okay. So I told you that the rugi over there in the urinary bladder, okay, because they're thrown into folds, but this trigone, the triangular shaped region, please get to know that, very important, because of the absorption of the mesonephric, that it is smooth. So by and large, what have we seen? In summary, what have we seen? I told you that the development of the urinary system is pretty simple, and all that I need is that I need only two structures. And what are these only two structures? I need what we call the urogenital sinus, okay, by way of this guy over here, the urogenital sinus, and I also need what we call the then I also need, yes, the nephrogenic cord, which will be coming from, of course, the intermediate mesoderm, okay. So that is what we see. Now, first things first, what do I see? I told you that the kidney will develop in three successive stages. We have what we call the pronephros fails to thrive. We go to what we call the penultimate stage, which is the mesonephros, which tries for, yes, a temporary period in early embryonic period, okay. Then of course, yes, we go to the ultimate one, which is of course the metanephros. And the metanephros, the duct from the mesonephros, we invade it, okay. We invade it by way of that duct, okay, which is of course the ureteric bud, okay. The terminal portion of the mesonephric duct, we invade it, and when it invades, there's that kind of local proliferation, okay, in the metanephros, which is called the metanephric blastema. And I told that the metanephric blastema is the one which will be giving rise to the secreted portion of what we call the kidney. We mentioned that one to you. And then of course this ureteric bud will give rise to, of course, the highly patterned structures that we find over here, which of course giving rise to the collecting portion of the kidney, okay. We've said that, please get to know that. Then apart from that, the urogenital sinus, okay, the vesical portion, okay, will give rise to, of course, the urinary bladder. The distal continuation, yes, will give rise to, of course, some portions of what we call the urethra. We've explained that one. Now, my friends, this urogenital sinus, the vesical portion, is continuous with the allantois. My friends, this allantois, yes, eventually becomes what we call the uracus. The one which, of course, in adult life, yes, it will become a remnant, okay, it becomes obliterated, okay, becoming what we call the median umbilical ligament, which will have a fold, going around it, okay. So that's what we see. If you look at the posterior surface of what we call the anterior abdominal wall, yes, getting below the umbilicus, you find this, this ligament over there, for that matter, the fold. Now, I told you that there's that septum. Initially, we call it, cloaca, so that that septum which will be separating the urogenital sinus, which is ventral, from what we call the cloaca. So from the what you call the one which will be the terminal portion of the hindgut, by way of the one which will be formed the rectum. So that I told that there was a thin membrane which is made up of only ectoderm and endoderm, not mesoderm, which is called cloacal membrane, which you have to rupture for the opening of the anal canal to be visible, as you can find over here. Okay, now one thing that we see is that developing ventral, okay, to the urogenital sinus over here will be, of course, the genital tubercle. And my friends, the genital tubercle, you know what it gives rise to? It will give rise to, what we call the clitoris, in females, and of course the glans penis in males. Okay, so that is, one thing that we find over here. So I believe you've got all these things that I'm trying to tell you. So in the next section, we'll look at the development of what you call the female reproductive and male reproductive systems. All right, I hope you find this meeting helpful. I'm very grateful for your time this evening. Have a good night, all of you, and may the good Lord richly bless you. Amen.